Funnily enough, that's a nice segue into a theoretical discussion about the application, design and other considerations in a warm-up. Again, recognising that other parts of classes will take you through more specific warm-ups and specific activities. This is really the foundation around that, of which that builds on. Because as a practitioner, following and understanding what others do to copy is certainly a nice way of learning and improving your professional development. But copying other practitioners just because of what team they work for defies what sports science is about, which is evidence-based practice with an understanding of the theory and the application. So understanding what practitioners do, understanding the theory, and then applying it to your environment is critical. And this section now will talk about some more theoretical constraints and constructs around the application and design of a warm-up. Some of this is intuitive, others are giving a name and a voice to some ideas that have existed for a while. So our aims of a warm-up, just to remind you, one is to increase body temperature. So the activity should increase body, muscle temperature, increase heart rate, increase cardiac output, promote muscle and skin blood flow and decrease fluid viscosity. Should create this physiological environment that optimises the ability to perform the relevant task. It should increase range of motion of the appropriate joints, because not all joints should increase their range of motion. So it should take a joint that is meant to, through a greater range of motion, to improve its ability to perform an action over a greater range of motion for a given task. It should perform sport-specific activities to recruit and to potentiate that muscle contraction, maximising the mental, the cognitive and the physical preparedness of that joint through a whole body activity in the right domain and the environment. Easy said, the actual application becomes a little bit more granular, a little bit more difficult. So when you're putting together a warm-up, in some ways it may be easy. Go run some laps, do some stretches, kick the ball, and away. In some ways those basics have existed for decades and meet all the different requirements. But whether they can be optimised and blended is where you as a practitioner come to your fore and make a name for yourself. Either way, you want to consider what is the mode and what's the composition? What are the activities involved in the warm-up? Sure, it could be go for a run. Give me 5 laps, kick the ball, do some stretches, and off we go. But are there better ways to promote that physiological state with an in tune to the actual football-specific skill sets? What's the intensity? If you tell players to go jog a few laps, that's what you get. Does that promote better muscle temperature and core body temperature? Does it promote cognitive involvement? Probably not. But the reverse is that coaches love to see high intensity work. They are pushing hard, moving hard, lots of noise, lots of action. That's great, it looks good. But what does that then do for ensuing fatigue if they've been doing a 20-25 minute high intensity warm-up on pitch for a long period of time? So again, find that optimal range. What's the duration? Sometimes if there's lethargy, and low motivation and low output from visual observation by coaches and staff, there's a tendency to increase the duration to try and find and search for that cognitive arousal. And in doing so, it may over-promote that physiological state. So again, this zone, this Goldilocks zone of the optimal intensity, duration, and mode, and that's dictated by the scheduling. And we'll talk about the training and match day context as well. So these are thoughts that when you're looking to tailor your warm-up, you'd be considering. You'd be ticking these boxes and not just assuming, well, I asked them to run 10 laps and I asked them to do some stretches and we did a few pickups and a few eccentric loading, they should be ready to go. That's what evidence-based practice is about. Do we do it because we've always done it, or do we do it because we're actually going to improve performance? So when you're designing the warm-up, again, easy to stand here and say, these are the things you should tick off. It's actually when you get to the granularity, the detail, the microscopic level of your environment, that dictates often how you do a warm-up, more so than I have to increase muscle temperature, increase core temperature, and I have to increase cardiac output. That as a warm-up is generic, superficial, and easy. How you do that in your environment is a difficulty. And some nice data here from, again, a survey of English Premier League practitioners showed the context in which they have to undertake a match day warm-up. So normally, the warm-up will be conducted at around about 30 minutes before the match. And that ranges from between 15 to 45 minutes. 90% of practitioners used a warm-up that it was at least 25 minutes. So they're doing a 30-minute warm-up, they're doing a 25-minute warm-up that is more than 30 minutes before match kickoff. And the time between the warm-up finishing and the kickoff is around about 12 minutes. So already that 10 to 15 minute time zone between doing your warm-up and starting the match means that all that physiological and cognitive arousal is starting to decrease. At halftime, there's approximately, by the time you get in off the pitch, sit down or do whatever you need to, and then leave again, about a 13-minute window, which coaches, support staff, players need to organise their own structure. So it leaves, on average, around 3 to 4 minutes to actually engage in re-warm-up activities. But a high level of practitioners, or a high proportion, so almost 90%, recognise the benefits. So it's not like that warm-up is under-recognised or underutilised. It's the translation of that generic concept of how and what to warm up into the reality of a match day or a training day perspective. So a little bit of schematic concept. So when you're designing a warm-up, we can see here the relationship, or the theoretical relationship, based on a grouping of a range of studies between short-term performance, theoretically, and warm-up intensity. So you can see there's a general increase from a control perspective up to around that 60 or 55 to 70% of VO2 max as a relative intensity. So very high intensities, which would be 100, 95, 100 and above percent of VO2 max, actually are detrimental to ensuring performance. The warm-up's creating too much fatigue. But very low intensity, so light jogging and easy work of less than 40 to 50% of VO2 max, actually under-prepare an athlete for the ensuing exercise bout, particularly if it's a high intensity speed power. So that Goldilocks zone, that really nice kind of zone, is between 60 to maybe 70% of VO2 max. If we look at longer duration performance, so this is intermediate, 5, 10, 15 minutes of high intensity work, we see that the warm-up intensity is a little bit higher. So it's up around that 65, 70, 75% mark. But either way, that 60 to 70% zone of VO2 max, representing an exercise intensity, is where you're looking to harness and gauge, or to devote your warm-up intensity to. So it's not very, very high. It's not very high intensity, but it's still not low intensity. The other thing there is the duration. And again, this is a schematic representation, is that the duration gets longer. There's a point where you get no additional benefits. And that point seems to be around that 8 to 10 minute mark. Okay, so warm-ups of more than 8 to 10 minutes from a physiological perspective don't necessarily provide any additional physiological response that's beneficial for performance outcomes. So already you're creating this picture based on theoretical of the intensity and the durations of certainly the physical and physiological components of your warm-up. So if we wanted to summarise that based on relevant literature, you'd look at a zone of, say, 60, 65% of VO2 max for about 5 to 10 minutes for high-intensity sprinting and power work. If it's too intensive, that's going to cause fatigue and suppress performance. If it's not enough, if it's too low, it's not going to promote optimal physiological state of core temperature, muscle temperature, cardiovascular, even though the cardiovascular load is minimal for high-intensity activity. It's going to certainly elevate metabolic processes through enzymes and the catalyst of that energy system being promoted due to higher temperatures. But you don't want to deplete your high-energy phosphate stores, particularly if your ensuing exercise bout is close. Though we know in a football context, we've got 10 to 15 minutes between the finish of the warm-up and the start of the match. So that's not normally going to be a problem. Ideally, orienting the muscle contraction to sport-specific activity is a no-brainer. For slightly longer performance from a warm-up perspective, again, specify the warm-up to the neuromuscular activation and neuromuscular processes of that activity. Elevate VO2, elevate muscle and core temperature. That 60 to 70, 75% of VO2 max as a relative intensity is a prime zone for at least 10 minutes or up to 10 minutes. That promotes that optimal physiological state. The brief burst of task-specific activity at the end of that is normal functioning and certainly optimal. The other thing is to be aware of overheating or over-increasing core temperature. And we'll talk about that later on in this class about warming up in the heat. So these are, again, some generic guidelines. But as we said before, those generic guidelines are quite easy to follow, and history kind of dictates. It's actually applying them to your training context or your match day context. And I guess in a training context, when it's a daily routine and players are coming in with varied motivation, varied fatigue status, varied arousal, and it's in a training environment, how you use that warm-up to engage them, to promote them of the need for the physical state that you want is very individualised. In some ways, the familiarity of a regular type of warm-up is an easy thing for athletes to do. But that very familiarity is what promotes complacency. Certainly in a training environment, you have more time to engage the warm-up that you want to prepare them optimally. But you also have more pressure from the coach because they will translate or transition directly from your warm-up into the coach's activities. And in that sense, that pressure for them to be ready for the training session is greater. Certainly, in that training environment, there's a greater ability to vary your warm-up to create better motivation, but at the expense of a lack of familiarity and an annoyance of constantly changing is the balance that you have to find. Another way to look at the warm-up, certainly in a training perspective, is it's a zone for more or extra conditioning. During in-season, the time that S&C or physical conditioning coaches have to do warm-ups during training sessions is reduced because it's more technical, tactical, on-ball work. Not to say a warm-up shouldn't engage with that, but quite often it won't. And some conditioning coaches go, right, this warm-up in a training context is for me to get extra load. It's 6 to 10 minutes of moderate to moderately high aerobic conditioning where I can get them working at 75, 80% of maximal aerobic speed to get some more 10 minutes of quality into the legs. That's fine if it's a particular outcome that you want to engage with. And in a training context, that will create an optimal physiological state, additional conditioning, but it certainly won't translate into ball touches and tactical and technical awareness, which is what the coach may be looking for. In a match context, the time pressure is a lot greater. There's a set regulation of what you can and can't do. The coach and the athlete demands for what they want to do on the day often overrides what practitioners and strength and conditioning coaches can or are allowed to do in those environments. The warm-up will provide a physiological stimulus, and it has to provide that physiological stimulus, but it also should provide that familiarity and is task specific. Now, how you engage with that? Constantly changing warm-ups on any given day promote unfamiliarity with the task performance, and a lack of familiarity with that performance actually relates into poor touches, poor outcomes, and this perceptual state of not being ready to perform. Whereas doing the same warm-up all the time, or doing under-complex or over-complex drills in that environment also promote additional poor outcomes. So finding that blend of enough physical movement for each player, so not necessarily as a group, but for each player to be moving enough at any given time with a task that they're familiar with and a drill that they know and a movement pattern that they know, but at the same time is not too repetitive and too familiar, they just go through the motions to create a little bit of cognitive awareness, is where a really nice developed warm-up is. It allows exposure to the conditions. It provides familiarity with engagement. It gives a task that is known but is still slightly novel and creates enough movement to create that physiological state. Now, how you put that together is the real beauty of a well-designed warm-up. You can just rely on, we run, we stretch, we then run throughs, we kick a ball, and then we're into it. But that silo kind of approach is really not where I think modern football can be in terms of strength conditioning coaches who understand what the coaches want and the drills they need to use and start to blend. Obviously, that's depending on your environment because that siloed approach still exists in a lot of clubs and a lot of spaces. But blending the physical, tactical, touch and emotional elements of a nice warm-up is where a real quality warm-up can exist. So let's finish off with a few other considerations that always pop up in this warm-up environment and are always raised as questions. So the first one is about ballistics. So preparing for the high-intensity movements in a football match or any sort of sporting environment, should you go ballistic activities? Now, the reality of ballistic activities during stretching or a warm-up is that it seems intuitive to prime a muscle by doing that activity, but it actually can be counterproductive because in the muscles we have multiple physiological or physical structures for neuromuscular proprioception. We have neural tendons in the Golgi tendon organ, which detect the load through that musculotendinous joint, which is normally the weakest part. We also have muscle spindle fibers that run the length of the muscle, which tell us about the tension and the loading rate of those muscles. Now, when you start doing ballistic, high range of motion, high speed, that sends off triggers from both of those two senses to reduce the contraction. So whilst your warm-up is trying to take a muscle through a range of motion at a high speed, high ballistic, high stretch, high range of motion activities actually are counterproductive because the GTO and the muscle spindle fibers send back neural signals saying, stop it, stop it, stop it. So you actually get a restriction of contraction, which is counterproductive to what the warm-up should be. So going ballistic in terms of high intensity, high ballistic muscle contractions should be considered with caution as part of a warm-up, or certainly not until you've moved through a progression of intensity to allow that. Another consideration is the type of activity that you undertake. For example, eccentric loading of a joint is very common now and very popular as a potential reduction in injury markers or injury risk. But we see that in some nice work from Rick Lovell's group, and there's a few other studies that support this, is that if you engage in, say, eccentric loading, so Nordic hamstring curls through the hamstring as a warm-up, you actually get a greater fatigue in the warm-up, from the warm-up. So that explicit targeting of a muscle group with the eccentric loading, so specific targeted eccentric loading of a muscle group, actually creates more fatigue for the ensuing exercise bout. So you can see big reductions in eccentric torque of the hamstring following Nordic hamstring curls prior as part of the pre-warm-up. So doing Nordic eccentric curls may have an injury risk reduction, according to a range of evidence, but that should probably happen away from a normal training environment and away from a pre-warm-up or during warm-up process before they go into full training or full match. And that's essentially the fatigue process. So eccentric loading of a muscle joint is definitely useful and can be important as an injury risk. But in eccentric loading or targeted eccentric loading of a joint prior to undertaking match or training may actually increase fatigue. So it's a good reminder that whilst one element of an activity may be beneficial, it may actually be counterproductive or negative, even though it seems like an intuitively good thing to do as a warm-up. Another consideration is re-warming up at half-time. Okay, so normally in a match context, players come in from the first half, they sit down, they gather what they need, coach instructions, specific technical and tactical discussions, and then by the time they're re-prepared, redressed, reorganised to leave, there's no time for warm-up. Some nice evidence shows that, as you'd expect, the more passive your half-time, the more seated, the more lower intensity, then the greater reduction in muscle temperature. So you come in with muscle temperature at moderate to high levels. If you don't re-engage in a warm-up during that half-time, muscle temperature will continue to decrease. And that's the normal thermoregulatory function of the body, to remove that heat when it's not exercising. Whilst that's good from a thermoregulatory state, it may not create an ideal muscle temperature to then restart second half performance at a high intensity. And some similar studies from some similar findings from another study is that in the red, where you can see muscle temperature and counter movement jump. So re-warming up at halftime increased muscle temperature and then also increased peak power and power performance in the preparation for second half. So whilst the common thought process historically is come in for half-time, sit, recover, recuperate, then go out and start again, we now look at it as, well, come in, recover, take your tactical and technical instructions, debrief, but then engage in some sort of moderate intensity exercise to promote higher muscle temperature, to promote a readiness to perform at higher intensities at the start of that second half. So again, re-warming up at half-time is now an important factor to consider, as opposed just to the warm-up at the start of a match. A last concept to think about is warming up in the heat. Sometimes warm-ups are dedicated as to, they need to look like this is how we do it, and we follow our routine regardless of what. Now, warming up in the heat is somewhat of a paradox, because yes, we know that warm-ups improve performance and create a physiological state, but we know that as core temperature gets too high, it reduces physical performance, particularly prolonged physical performance. So there's a greater fatigue from higher core temperatures in the heat. And an example here of where a 20-minute warm-up compared to a 10-minute warm-up compared to no warm-up during repeated sprint exercise in the heat. And we can see that the longer warm-up, 20 minutes, promoted a higher core temperature, okay, and a higher cardiovascular load. But it also promoted a reduction in physical performance in terms of work completed. So this is where a warm-up is good, but over-producing or over-completing excessive warm-up in already hot conditions results in a reduction in performance. So making your warm-up adaptable to your environment and your context and your conditions is critical to performance outcome. So just performing a warm-up just because we have to doesn't necessarily result in beneficial outcomes. Similar studies showing the same thing, passive cooling versus passive warming up. We can see that the passive heating before performing exercise in the heat, and this is intermittent football-like performance, promotes higher core temperatures and promotes a bigger reduction in performance over that 60 minutes. So again, overheating before undertaking exercise in the heat has reductions in performance outcomes that relate to football physical performance. So finding that Goldilocks zone, that interaction of a sufficient warm-up, but maybe reduction when you're exercising in the heat, should be your consideration when undertaking warm-ups in hot conditions. We want to increase muscle temperature, but we want to maintain lower body temperature overall. Now, whether you do that by increasing muscle activity in the heat, but by adding cooling mechanisms, or whether you adapt the time and the intensity of your warm-up is up to your environment. But certainly in the heat, limit the exposure and the rise in core temperature while still maximising muscle temperature. Finally, let's think about what other considerations prevent a warm-up from occurring. So when this surveyed, again the survey of EPL teams shows that the biggest issue in undertaking a warm-up relate to the lack of time and the unwillingness of the coaches or the managers to actually undertake that warm-up. So again, the logistical constraints around the warm-up dictate the effectiveness. So it's all well and good for me to wax lyrical for the last period of time in this class about the theory of a warm-up, but the transition to that environment with that manager, with those players, in that logistical environment is the key to a good warm-up. You know, ideally, a developmental warm-up through lower to higher intensity work with the ball that involves plyometric, rapid change of direction and high agility work is fine. But sometimes when you only have 5, 6, 7 minutes to do it, that's not feasible. So being able to develop and adapt your warm-up where you still have familiarity from the players, because as you make things up on the spot, the time for instructions, the cognitive load from those instructions and the time it takes to give those instructions all prevent you actually having a good warm-up. The other side of this, that in certain contexts, players have an ideal preparation. And at the higher level that you work at, obviously that ingrained routine of those high-performance players limits their interest in undertaking warm-ups. So players already know what they need to do. So how does your warm-up facilitate that? But that's not to say that what the players want to do is an optimal outcome. So how do you marry up your knowledge of the physical, physiological and cognitive and familiarity of your activities based on what the coach wants, based on what the player thinks they want, and find that nexus? That's the difficulty. And certainly, you know, in other classes, the types of activities and the engagement we'll go through to actually show you what you can use or what you may already be using. I guess the other thing is that players have a set routine in match day. In training, you know, it's more willing to go along, but certainly players have a set perception of what they need and what they want to do. And warm-up should try and capture that, and your understanding of that comes from your familiarity with your players as well. So final points. The structure of the warm-up certainly influences the potential improvements. The warm-up needs to become specific to that activity. It should be viewed as an integral part of a training session, promoting conditioning, promoting readiness, promoting preparedness for tactical and technical work. Okay? And strength and conditioning professionals really should have this flexible toolkit of what they want and when they need to use warm-up activities in short, medium and long term, and be prepared to adjust those based on the environment, the conditioning and the arousal and motivation of players, as well as the perception of what the coach wants. And it's this nexus that turns the theory, which is fairly simple, do moderate or more of warm-up, into the actual applied effective outcomes that you want as a practitioner. And you have to recognise that there are alternate views. I'll leave this for you to read, but obviously a world-renowned, fantastic, high-performance player who absolutely detests the concept of a warm-up states that, you know, it no doubt that it has limited effect on how he performs. He has his own views on what the warm-up is. And not to say that is wrong, but how you engage with a high-profile, very effective player who has their own perceptions on what they need to do to prepare that may or may not be optimal is the key as a good physical conditioning and strength and conditioning coach, if not sports scientist, to create a warm-up that adapts to the athlete, but still provides those specific outcomes around the theory that we've discussed that fits into the demands of what a coach or a match day context requires. So I'll leave you with this alternate view of whether warm-ups are or aren't useful, but as a practitioner, this is a challenge for you to develop a specific warm-up that you can tailor and develop for a range of environments that has an athlete like this happy and prepared to engage in their warm-up. All the best. Thank you.